In our lead story today, we step inside the defense services of the nation of Ukraine, where President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and his close allies are dealing with a problem far from the front lines. The issue in question is that of assassination, and after well over 2 years in which Zelenskyy has been Russia's prime target, the Ukrainian leader has taken increasingly far-reaching steps to protect not only his own life, but those of his most critical partners in government. The news broke on June the 24th, when Zelenskyy issued a surprise order to purge the country's state security service. Known as the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine is an internal security bureau, several tens of thousands of personnel strong, conducting counterintelligence and anti-terrorism operations inside Ukraine. It's been heavily involved with counter-espionage in defense of the Ukrainian state since Russia's full-scale engagement kicked off in 2022, and the service has drawn international acclaim, working with the American CIA and NSA, intercepting the phone calls of Russian generals in order to target them for assassination, obtain admissions of guilt around war crimes, and expose some of the internal problems of the Russian military. But it's also come into intermittent conflict with Ukraine's highest leaders. The issue at hand, on June the 24th, was an assassination attempt that had been foiled a bit over a month prior in early May of this year. According to Ukrainian counterintelligence at the time, 2 suspected assassins had been detained on suspicion of carrying out a plan that had been drawn up for them by Russia's FSB, its Federal Security Service. The sticking point, though, was that the 2 assassins in question were themselves officers within the Ukrainian SBU. Both of them were colonels who had allegedly been recruited by the Russian FSB prior to the 2022 invasion. The plot allegedly called for the assassination of not just Zelenskyy, but Ukraine's director of military intelligence and other top military and political figures in advance of Russian President Vladimir Putin's inauguration to a 5th term in office on the same day that the assassins' capture was announced. Per the Ukrainian SBU, the 2 assassins and a team of people they would recruit, including individuals close to Zelenskyy's security detail, would first have taken Zelenskyy hostage. Then they would have used him to pinpoint the location of other senior Ukrainians who could be targeted via rocket, missile, and drone attacks. Then they would have killed him. Conflicting reports from within Ukraine suggest that there may also have been a backup plan to target Zelenskyy via a drone strike using drones that these 2 now arrested Ukrainians had already obtained. Ukraine has named 3 alleged Russian spies that it says coordinated the operation from Moscow, and it's since charged both former SBU colonels with treason. Of course, a plot of such apparent severity would demand a response within Ukraine, and this week the response finally came. Ukraine's SBU got a new leader, a colonel named Alexei Morozov, whose predecessor had been fired 2 days after the May 2024 assassination attempt was revealed. Over Telegram, Zelenskyy laid out what would become a new set of terms for those working with Ukraine's highest internal security bureau. The new SBU leader's main task per Zelenskyy wouldn't be one of tactics or strategy, but of recruitment, ensuring that only Ukrainians with demonstrable loyalty to their nation, and with it their wartime cause, would be allowed to join. Continued Zelenskyy, quoting him now, "And of course, the agency must be cleared of anyone who chooses not Ukraine for themselves or discredits the State Guard service." The resulting effect, a likely large-scale and far-reaching purge of the Ukrainian SBU, hasn't been revealed to the public, but it's widely expected that those purges will follow. For a nation at war, like Ukraine, embarking on such an effort in its highest security service comes with some clear benefits, but also some pretty clear costs. On the positive end, it's hard to argue with the idea that having a security force loyal to Ukraine instead of Russia, while Ukraine is in the middle of a full-scale war with Russia, is really fair enough. Not only that, but the Ukrainian SBU has long been accused of bloat, mismanagement, and incompetence at its lower level, something that a drawdown of personnel could help to address, even if the litmus test for employment is loyalty rather than competency. But then there's the other side of the coin. Purges and loyalty tests do not have a history of going well in the vast majority of intelligence or security bureaus where they've been attempted, both past and present. With those purges come the opportunity for people to jockey for power, authority, or advancement over zealous investigators that are incentivized to generate results, in this case firings in large numbers, even if cases are incomplete or unsubstantiated, and the loss of expertise that comes with both firings and a smaller, loyalty-based hiring pool. Ukraine, in particular, is a society influenced by deep ties to both Russia and Europe, where the question of loyalty is often complicated, even if a person's willingness to conduct the SBU's work on Ukraine's behalf wouldn't be in doubt. Closing the circle in Ukraine's SBU, in a country already fighting for its own survival, may lower the risk of insider attacks on the country's leadership. At the same time, it could contribute to lowered expertise and higher paranoia in an organization that needs both a collective clear head as well as all the help it can get. And when it comes to Ukraine and Zelenskyy's broader reasons to be paranoid, well, unfortunately, There are plenty. For the government in Kyiv, assassination attempts don't appear to be anything new since the Russian invasion. We do have to take many of Ukraine's claims with a grain of salt here. Some lack external verification or are sparse on detail, and the Zelenskyy administration certainly has incentives to portray its wartime leader as a sort of hunted survivor figure, if those incentives were something that they chose to act on. Yet even if half of what Ukraine claims about Zelenskyy's safety is true, then the guy has really been through it in these past few years. According to Zelenskyy himself, the year 2022 alone saw no fewer than 10 attempts on his life, all obviously unsuccessful, and since the war began, Zelenskyy has been kept under a veil of secrecy. His movements in and out of the country are hidden. His visits to locations inside Ukraine are only publicly announced after he's already come and gone, and when he holds events in Kyiv, they're subject to press embargoes until Zelenskyy has already left that location and moved on. Even despite all the cloak and dagger stuff, Zelenskyy has seen plenty of his potential killers be intercepted. In one example from 2013, in August, Ukraine arrested an unidentified woman from the Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv who was passing an itinerary of Zelenskyy's movements to Russian handlers so that they could call in an airstrike on his location. In another, a Polish man was arrested inside Poland after agreeing to pass airport security information to Russia, specifically in regards to the primary airport Poland uses to ferry military supplies, humanitarian aid, and Ukrainian leaders in and out of a safe NATO nation airfield. And dating all the way back to the early days of Russia's invasion, Zelenskyy was the target of not one, but two large-scale efforts to find and eliminate him. One involving over 400 mercenaries from the Wagner Group hunting him down inside Kyiv, and one from a lesser-known mercenary organization called Radat that sent some 1,000 fighters into the region around Kyiv, only to be trapped and see their numbers devastated by Ukrainian forces well armed with counterintelligence. And while we're on the subject of things Ukraine's got to be paranoid about, it's worth taking a moment and addressing Russia's far broader recent turn towards sabotage and other forms of meddling, both in Ukraine and in the NATO member nations of Europe. Just this week, Russian saboteurs were implicated in an arson attack last month against a German arms factory outside of Berlin, attempting to inhibit the delivery of weapons to Ukraine. Earlier this month, Poland's interior minister announced that the nation had arrested no fewer than 18 people over the past 6 months on charges of planning sabotage or other acts inside Poland on behalf of Russia and its close ally Belarus. Those 18, by the way, include the Polish man that we just mentioned, arrested on suspicion of helping another Zelenskyy assassination attempt. In April, Germany arrested 2 German-Russian nationals on suspicion that they plotted sabotage attacks against American military facilities in the nation in attempts to undermine Western military support for Ukraine. That same month, 4 men were charged in Britain with an arson attack against a commercial property in London with links to Ukraine in an act allegedly paid for directly by Russian intelligence. Russia is believed to be behind thousands of recent cyber attacks against European railways, especially Czech ones, as well as an elaborate hack of Germany's Social Democratic Party and several defense and aerospace corporations. And aircraft flying over the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean Sea have dealt with vastly increased incidents of GPS jamming over the last couple of months. Taken together, the combination of continued Russian assassination and subversion attempts inside Ukraine and apparent physical and digital sabotage operations across Europe, they paint a far more telling picture than when each part is viewed in isolation. For a Russian nation that has, for the most part, used cruise missiles and drones to release its wrath on Ukrainian targets that its ground troops can't reach, pivot to more covert operations, both against Ukraine and its Western partners, is a fairly big deal. Perhaps the switch is in response to Ukraine's heightened ability to hit targets deep inside Russia with its own drones, and probably its own saboteurs, or perhaps it's in hopes of imposing greater costs on Western supporters of Ukraine in hopes that they may rethink the sort of assistance that they provide. More likely than not, it's a combination of both. But whatever the underlying reason, it's increasingly clear that Russia is looking to broaden the scope of its offensive beyond just expending munitions at the front lines or devastating civilian infrastructure in the Ukrainian power grid across the country. Russia is thinking outside the box, now more than ever, in a war that promises to grow more complicated by the day. And for our next story today, we're traveling to the Caribbean, where Kenya's police intervention in Haiti was last week eclipsed by chaos in Kenya itself. It should have been the moment that Nairobi placed itself firmly in the Western camp. On Tuesday, June the 25th, the first consignment of Kenyan police officers arrived in Haiti to begin a peacekeeping mission. One designed to wrest control of the capital, Port-au-Prince, from an insurgent group of heavily armed street gangs. Now, if you follow the Situation Room regularly, you will know that we've been covering Haiti for a while now. The political turmoil that led to a collapse in the functioning of the state, the gang violence that started out as anarchy before slowly morphing into something closer to an armed uprising. You'll probably remember too the brutal statistics. How up to 90% of Port-au-Prince is now under the control of armed groups. How the first 3 months of 2024 alone saw almost 2,500 casualties from the violence, likely making Haiti, per capita, the most murderous nation in Latin America. As such, the arrival of the Kenyan-led force after months of delays was always going to be one of last week's major stories. The beginning of what could either become a military quagmire for the African nation, or else, perhaps, the salvation of Haiti's suffering people. In the West, the hope was that it might be the latter. Although Nairobi is the one leading the intervention, Washington is bankrolling it, with a little help from Canada, France, and Spain. Because of this, Tuesday was a day of fanfare on Uncle Sam's part. Joe Biden publicly praised Kenya for its commitment. That same day, the United States publicly designated Nairobi a major non-NATO ally. The Telegraph explains that this makes Kenya the first state in sub-Saharan Africa to receive such an accolade. For Kenyan President William Ruto, the designation was his reward for spending the 2 years since his election pulling Nairobi ever closer to Washington, turning Kenya into one of America's best friends on the African continent. But if President Ruto did allow himself a quick pat on the back, the feeling can't have lasted very long. Just as Kenyan police officers were landing in Haiti to restore order, the Kenyan capital itself was plunging into anarchy. The day started in Nairobi with large but peaceful protests against a raft of new taxes being pushed through by William Ruto's government. Despite being one of Africa's powerhouse economies, Kenya is drowning in debt. The New York Times describes how, quoting here, the country's staggering $80 billion in domestic and foreign public debt accounts for nearly 3/4 of Kenya's entire economic output. Paying back even the interest is crippling the economy. 27% of all tax revenue collected goes on paying off the interest payments alone. Now, this isn't that unusual in Africa. The Times notes that half of all people living on the continent live in countries that spend more on interest payments than they do on health or education. But Kenya is certainly an outlier in the measures that the government was willing to take to avoid default. Desperate to raise cash, the nation's leaders planned a raft of new taxes. In early versions of the bill, this included things like slapping a sales tax of 16% on bread and taxing everything from bank transfers to internet data to diapers. For our American viewers, this is a little like if King George III had decided the Stamp Act was way too soft on the colonists and thrown in additional taxes on pantaloons and wigs. Ordinary people in Kenya, they were pissed. While the government scrapped some of the more onerous items, they went ahead with the bill despite growing public anger. By Tuesday afternoon, it was clear this had been a bad move. As the protests swelled in Nairobi and other cities, the police turned to increasingly brutal tactics to hold them back. Amid tear gas, water cannons, and beatings, the crowds pushed forward. Around mid-afternoon, the police effectively surrendered Nairobi city centre. Bad as this was, though, the worst was yet to come. Reaching the parliament, where the vote was being held, the protesters overwhelmed the last lines of defence. In scenes somewhat reminiscent of January the 6th or the storming of Brazil's Congress last year, the crowds surged into the building. MPs were forced to flee as windows were smashed and fires set. Before long, the seat of government had been abandoned to the rioters. The next few hours saw carnage across Kenya. Local newspaper The Nation claims protests rocked 35 of the country's 47 counties, including William Ruto's hometown. There was looting and arson in major cities. Police used live ammunition to try and restore order. By the time the dust settled, over a day of chaos, Reuters reports that 23 people have been killed, with somewhere in the region of 300 injured. 50 people have been arrested, with many of them seemingly disappeared by the security forces. But the protesters had at least achieved their original goal. On Wednesday, President Ruto declared that he would not sign into law the tax bill he'd once championed. Whether that will be enough to dampen the fire raging through Kenyan society, that's another matter. You see, this segment's being written on the afternoon of Thursday, June 27th. As things stand, right now, more protests have been called, and demands have grown to include William Ruto's resignation. Minutes ago, the BBC posted an article claiming the police have fired tear gas at crowds gathering in Nairobi. Now, obviously, we can't see into the future, so we have no idea how successful the Kenyan president will be at handling the unrest. But we can give our opinion, and it's that things don't look very good for him. In the past, mass protests and political violence in Kenya has usually been along ethnic lines. The Nation describes how division among the main ethnic groups have traditionally been a key driver of politics and protest, with members of one group coming out against what they see as favoritism towards another. This time, though, the driving factors seem to be age and class. The movement has no clear leadership and instead seems to be propelled by middle-class Gen Zers on social media, uniting around their shared anger at elite corruption and the soaring cost of living. In particular, their anger appears focused on President Ruto and those closest to him. Elected as a hustler who would champion the working poor, Ruto is instead governed as a tax and spend type who browbeats the population for not paying enough. At the same time, he lives a conspicuously lavish lifestyle, doing things like taking a private jet to the United States instead of using the presidential plane. For ordinary Kenyans, such excess from the man raising their taxes, kinda hard to stomach. Because of this link to cost of living and frustration at elite corruption, the closest comparison point to these protests may not be January 6th, what happened in Brazil last year, but similar unrest that has hit the global south since the pandemic. Colombia in 2021 saw wide-scale violent protests following an unpopular tax reform. In 2022, an economic crisis in Sri Lanka led to protesters storming the presidential mansion. Although both countries survived the crises, the upheaval lasted weeks and severely destabilized both governments. If Kenya now follows a similar pattern, it could be a long time before William Ruto can sleep sound in his bed at night. In the meantime, the bitter irony of a Kenyan police force going to Haiti to restore order just as disorder grips Nairobi has not been lost on anybody. Voice of America interviewed protesters who noted how we have taken our police to Haiti to fight people from other nationalities when at home we are not at peace. At the moment, there don't appear to be any plans to cancel the Haiti intervention due to the unrest in Kenya. Yet the experience of the last few days suggests that restoring order to Port-au-Prince may be harder than expected. After all, if Kenya's security forces can't contain crowds of unarmed demonstrators on their home turf, what hope do they have against Haiti's heavily armed insurgent groups? It's a difficult question, and it's one we don't have the answer to. All we can say for sure is that this latest unrest has doubtless added an extra level of difficulty to the Haiti intervention. Difficulty that President Ruto must wish that he could have avoided. From Haiti now, we travel to the Red Sea to revisit an organization that has been a mainstay here on Warographics for the better part of a year: Yemen's Houthi rebels. Starting in mid-October of 2023, the Houthi movement and its militant organization have embarked on a campaign of missile and armed drone attacks in an attempt to demand that Israel halt its ongoing invasion and military operations in the Gaza Strip as part of the Israel-Hamas war. But as any long-time viewer of this channel will know by now, the Houthis aren't just looking to attack Israel directly. Instead, their target is global trade, specifically the wide array of commercial and trading vessels that sail through the immensely important sea route the Houthis happen to border, the Red Sea. But in recent weeks, what seemed as if it might have been a Houthi campaign disabled by Western air power has picked back up in a way that proves the organization is only getting more dangerous. The current round of attacks began with a few lucky, unsuccessful missile launches in late May, after a quiet stretch in which the Houthis hadn't caused any significant damage to a ship in months. But that all changed on May the 28th, when a Greek-owned ship flagged to the Marshall Islands was hit by a total of 5 Houthi missiles in quick succession. The ship, a bulk carrier called the Lax, was hauling a cargo of grain, ironically headed to Iran, the same nation that happens to be the Houthis' main backer. While in transit through the Red Sea, it was struck without warning by a first wave of missiles, ripping a hole in its hull at the waterline and causing it to take on water. A second wave appeared to strike the deck of the ship. According to a team of inspectors from the nearby African nation of Djibouti, drones were also used in the attack. Luckily, the ship's 13 crew and 3 security guards were evacuated from the ship, and the Lax was able to limp away from the scene and continue its voyage. According to transponder data via marinetraffic.com, the ship is now safely in port in the Emirati city of Sharjah. But in this renewed wave of Houthi attacks, the damage done to the Lax was just the beginning. On June the 9th, the United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, confirmed that 2 more ships had been attacked in the Red Sea within the prior 24 hours. The first was a container ship called the Tavashi, flying under the flag of Liberia and owned by a company in Switzerland. Sailing in the Gulf of Aden, just southeast of the Red Sea and separated by the narrow Bab al-Mandeb Strait, the Tavashi was struck by a Houthi anti-ship ballistic missile. Although it was able to escape the area under its own power, it was damaged in the attack with no crew injured, and a second follow-on missile attack had to be intercepted by a nearby coalition warship. Hours later, a German-owned cargo ship called the Norderney, sailing under the flag of Antigua and Barbados, was struck by a pair of missiles. Again, no crew on board the vessel were hurt, but the ship sustained significant damage and an onboard fire, which the crew eventually managed to put out. But then came the big one, the most devastating attack thus far in the current round of violence. This time, the target was a Liberia-flagged, Greek-owned coal carrier called the Tutor, traveling through the southern Red Sea on a voyage from Russia to India. But instead of being struck by a flying suicide drone or a missile, she was hit by something that signals a potentially seismic shift in the Houthi offensive a sea drone or unmanned surface vessel described after the fact by the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations as a, quote, small 5 to 7 meter, 16 to 23 foot long craft of white color. Sitting low in the water, equipped with 2 mannequins inside meant to look like its operators, the sea drone approached the Tutor directly at the stern or the rear and detonated on impact. The explosion severely damaged the ship's engine room and killed a crew member there, disabling the vessel, starting a fire and causing severe internal flooding. Then the Tutor fell under attack from multiple anti-ship ballistic missiles and a swarm of drones, with at least one of the missiles again hitting the engine room and causing even more damage. Another of the ship's 22-person crew was injured in the attack, and eventually coalition forces were able to assist the crew in abandoning ship. 6 days after the vessel was attacked, it was confirmed to have sunk, in the second successful sinking of a cargo ship since the Houthi campaign of attacks began. The sinking of the Tutor was a major turn of events for several reasons. On the one hand, it represented confirmation that the Houthis' previously known ability to sink a ship, which they did to a vessel called the Rubimar in February, killing 3 crew, was not a one-off, and that the capability to sink large seagoing vessels is something the Houthis can consistently accomplish. That development alone is likely enough to drive up the costs of maritime trade through the Red Sea even further, by way of insurers charging incredible premiums to companies that intend to sail ships through places where they're now not unlikely to be sunk. Companies can either pay even more to transit the Red Sea or take far longer alternate routes, further driving up costs for all and driving down the world of sea-dependent trade. That was something that insurance companies were hesitant to do after the Rubimar sank, but a second sunk ship may well change the game for those same insurers. But far more important from a conflict perspective is the use of a maritime drone, or USV, by the Houthi organization. Sea drones are still a relatively new technology in 21st century warfare, but they're not quite a novelty item anymore, with Ukraine using them to great effect in their ongoing war against Russia. In fact, we've recently published an episode all about Ukraine's incredible sea drones if you're interested. Nor are the Houthis unfamiliar with sea drones. They've used smaller scale USVs to attack Saudi vessels in port during Saudi Arabia's counterinsurgency efforts against them in the past, and in February of this year, the US military announced that it had struck an unmanned underwater vehicle, or UUV, basically a drone submarine, that the Houthis had in their arsenal. But for the Houthis to actually use a USV successfully in an attack, well, that's a whole other level of danger. USVs are able to carry much larger payloads than aerial drones. They're far harder to detect, track, and intercept, and they're a far greater threat when they make impact, since they hit right at the vessel's waterline and are far more likely to rip a hole through its hull. And when it came to this particular attack, the Houthis themselves appeared more than willing to make clear that USV capabilities are now in their arsenal. After the attack, the Houthis released footage of the Tutor being struck several times by explosive munitions, most likely the USV and missile that we mentioned earlier, at a bare minimum. And even as the Tutor was taken on water on its way to the seafloor, the Houthis demonstrated another ability they'd struggled to show previously: the ability to continually hammer new targets across the Red Sea and keep up the pressure. The day after the Tutor was hit, a Ukrainian-owned ship called the Verbena, operated by a Polish company and sailing under the flag of Palau, was struck by no fewer than 3 cruise missiles as it sailed through the Gulf of Aden to Yemen's south. Aboard the Verbena, a crew member was severely injured by the missile strikes and the ship was set ablaze. This time, a nearby warship was able to evacuate the wounded merchant sailor while firefighting efforts continued on board. The vessel, carrying wood en route to Italy, was still able to move under its own power, but as the fire spread, the crew was forced to abandon the ship. At the time of writing, the Verbena is believed to be still drifting through the Gulf of Aden, with no new data from the ship's onboard transponder in several days. Floating out there alone, it's highly vulnerable to subsequent attacks, and while its onboard fires alone are unlikely to sink it, follow-on missile, drone, or USV attacks could likely do the job. At the time of writing, it is, to the best of our knowledge, still afloat. And even that's not the end of the most recent attacks. On June the 23rd, the Greek-owned, Liberia-flagged bulk carrier Transworld Navigator was hit while traveling through the Red Sea in an attack that the Houthis claimed involved the use of another uncrewed sea drone. Per US CENTCOM, the vessel was actually struck by aerial drones, but sustained only moderate damage and minor injuries to the crew, with the ability to continue on its voyage. Unverified video has circulated on social media purportedly showing the Transworld Navigator struck by a USV on the water, although that is as yet unconfirmed. If true, that would indicate that USVs may be a more common part of the Houthi arsenal than previously suspected. And one day later, on Monday, June the 24th, the Houthis demonstrated their ability to launch longer-range attacks against a yet unidentified ship that was sailing some 280 miles from Yemen's port of Nishtun on the country's furthest southeastern tip. The vessel was so far away, in fact, that it was closest to the island of Socotra, currently under control of the allies of Yemen's internationally recognized government in exile. That's very, very far from Houthi territory. And while the Houthis haven't yet claimed that attack, they are believed to be the most likely suspects. The Houthis have only been credited with one other attack further away from their territory than that, when a Portuguese-flagged container ship was attacked in early May, 600 kilometers from the Yemeni coast, although some sources claim that the attack on that ship, the MSC Orion, may have actually come from Iran. Like the Orion attack, the hit on this most recent faraway ship purportedly caused no real damage, with all hands on board reported safe. Although the Houthis still appear to be far from the level of effectiveness where every strike they launch would result in a direct hit, the fact remains that the group is clearly growing in its capabilities. Despite coalition airstrikes, drone overflights to collect intelligence, and intense international pressure, the Houthis still appear perfectly able to conduct large numbers of attacks. At the time of writing, 14 such attacks have been reported in just the month of June 2024, many of which use multiple weapons or even multiple sorts of weapons. And then there's the damage they're able to cause, as Joshua Hutchinson, the managing director of intelligence and risk for the maritime security firm Ambre, put it, quoting him here, "The data would also say the Houthis are getting more successful with direct hits." We do have to emphasize here, of course, that not all the claims that the Houthis make about their own attacks have gone on to be substantiated. For example, the group has claimed to have hit several warships, including the American aircraft carrier Dwight D. Eisenhower, but those claims have been roundly dismissed, and no evidence has since come to light to validate them. It also claimed to have sunk the Verbena shortly after it was struck, although that does not currently seem to be the case. But what cannot be denied is that the organization is more consistently able to do more damage with more weapons against more targets than ever before. So, faced with such a threat, the next question we have to ask is a pretty obvious one. Where the hell is the US-led military coalition when the Red Sea shipping needs them? And the answer is they're there. They're patrolling the Red Sea, but they're not conducting interceptions at anything near the 100% success rate that most of the world is hoping for. On Sunday, June the 9th, for example, US CENTCOM announced that it had destroyed 2 cruise missiles and a missile launcher in Houthi-controlled Yemen, and that American and British warplanes had carried out airstrikes in Yemen in direct response to the twin attacks that we mentioned earlier on the Norderney and the Tavashi. Then, in response to the attacks on the Tutor before it sank, US airstrikes destroyed 7 radar installations under Houthi control with which the organization had targeted the ship. The day the Verbena was hit, CENTCOM stated that it had destroyed 2 Houthi patrol boats, another sea drone, and an aerial drone, as they were about to imminently threaten other ships on the Red Sea. And seemingly every day, the US and other coalition naval powers claim successful missile and drone interceptions. But given the recent carnage on the Red Sea, those actions don't appear to be nearly enough to mitigate the threat the Houthis pose. Not only that, but the Houthis are believed to have brought down multiple American MQ-9 Reaper drones at this point in the conflict, using what the Houthis allege were locally made surface-to-air missiles. Each of those drones costs the US some $50 million, further adding to the costs the Houthis are able to impose not just on global trade, but the militaries trying to deal with them. And the adapting capabilities of the Houthis, most of all their use of harder-to-find, harder-to-stop sea drones, means that the efficacy of the coalition as it works right now is likely to get worse, not better. All the while, the world's maritime trade organizations continue to sound the alarm that something more must be done, and quickly. As the International Chamber of Shipping wrote in a forceful statement following the attacks on the Tutor and the Verbena that was co-signed by a wide range of trade organizations, quoting here, "This is an unacceptable situation, and these attacks must stop now. We call for the states with influence in the region to safeguard our innocent seafarers and for the swift de-escalation of the situation in the Red Sea. We've heard the condemnation and appreciate the words of support, but we urgently seek action to stop the unlawful attacks on these vital workers and this vital industry." Put another way, the status quo in the Red Sea simply isn't good enough. At the time of writing, it's June 2024, we've seen nearly an 80% reduction in bulk carriers traveling through the Suez Canal versus June of 2023. And those were statistics collected and compared before the sinking of the Tutor. Now insurance prices are likely to rise yet again. The Red Sea is likely to empty out even further. Shipping delays and costs will continue to rise, and the people all over the world who depend on maritime shipping are going to feel the pain. But perhaps most damning of all, to echo the International Chamber of Shipping's point about just how unacceptable the current situation is, a Red Sea that sees 20% of its usual shipping traffic means fewer ships to protect, using a significantly heightened number of warships on patrol. All that ostensibly in the coalition's favor, and yet the Houthis sink more ships, kill and injure more people, and continue to develop new ways to carry out their mission. In the coming weeks and months, the Houthi rebels will likely be emboldened by their recent success, and their rate of attacks would suggest that they possess ample munitions to conduct more strikes in the very near future. If the last month has proved anything in the Red Sea, it's that successful strikes by the Houthis under the current status quo are all but inevitable. And if that's the case, then it's only a matter of time before more ships start disappearing for good beneath the waves. And now, let's turn our attention to Darfur. As you watch this, a city of 2 million people stands on the brink, besieged by an overwhelming military force, under constant shelling. Across the wider world, there are fears that the slaughter could soon reach the level of genocide. And no, this isn't another segment about Ukraine, it's not another story about the Gaza war. Instead, it's happening amid the world's great forgotten conflict in Sudan, a war that has already caused the planet's worst displacement crisis, with 10 million forced to flee their homes, and it may have killed up to 150,000 people. Yet even by these lamentable standards, the siege of Al-Fasher is on another level. Sealed off from the outside world, its residents are suffering acute hunger. The last 3 months have seen a mere 22 aid trucks allowed through to distribute food. At least 20,000 buildings already lie in ruins. After the last hospital was forced to close on June the 10th, the local healthcare system has effectively collapsed. Yet we didn't want to highlight this story purely for humanitarian reasons, although those certainly play a part. Rather, we wanted to emphasize that Al-Fasher's fate will have repercussions far beyond Sudan. The last army stronghold in Darfur, a region the size of Spain, its fall could effectively split the nation in two. The implications of this are something we'll be covering later. Before that, though, we need to paint you a quick picture of Al-Fasher, a city that may soon play host to one of the war's bloodiest battles. The first thing to note about the capital of North Darfur is that few agree on exactly how many live there. In a 2009 document, the UN estimates a population of over 500,000. A few months ago, The Economist put the figure at closer to 2.8 million. That is a huge discrepancy, but it isn't caused by miscounting. Al-Fasher, you see, has long been a haven for those fleeing violence in the countryside. During the Darfur genocide 20 years ago, tens of thousands sought shelter there. In the current conflicts, anywhere up to 1 million are believed to have poured into its streets. That makes discerning the true number next to impossible, although we at least have an idea of who those millions of people might be. Aside from the 30,000 members of the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, currently holed up in a base in the center of town, the majority of those in Al-Fasher are likely Black Darfuris from an ethnic group like the Zakhawa. We know this because mass displacing darker-skinned Darfuris is something the Rapid Support Forces have excelled at. A paramilitary group that rose out of the notorious Janjaweed militias that conducted the Darfur genocide, the RSF is the SAF's main opponent in the war. Ethnically Arab and under the control of a warlord known as Haiti, the group is open about its dreams of ethnically cleansing dark-skinned Darfuris like the Masalit, Fur, and Zakhawa from the land. A shocking Human Rights Watch report recently quoted one of their commanders as saying of the Masalit, "We decided that we don't want to leave any alive, not even the children." In recent weeks, the RSF has gone on a spree of destruction, burning villages and towns around Al-Fasher and sending tens of thousands more fleeing into the already overcrowded city. Now, they seem hell-bent on its capture, slowly pushing it from the north and east amid heavy fighting. And it's here that we get to the big fear of the looming battle, the worry that an RSF victory could lead to a citywide massacre. Back in autumn, Hamedi's troops succeeded in capturing El Janina, the capital of West Darfur. What followed was a multi-day rampage targeting the civilian population. The Telegraph writes that, quoting here, witnesses said refugees were rounded up and shot or forced into the river to drown. According to a UN investigation, as many as 15,000 people were killed in under a week. Nor was El Janina a one-off. In city after city, RSF victories in Darfur have been accompanied by eye-watering violence against non-Arabs. Yet Al-Fasher is likely to be the worst of it all. Not just because it's the biggest, but because conditions around it are so bad that those trapped inside have nowhere to go. When El Janina was conquered, thousands upon thousands of Masalites and other locals were able to flee across the border into Chad, a mere 30 kilometers away. From Al-Fasher, by contrast, the New York Times reports that those trying to leave are having to walk for almost 300 kilometers in temperatures over 48 Celsius through a landscape stalked by famine. So little food can be found in the region that Médecins Sans Frontières has estimated that a child dies from hunger every 2 hours in the Zamzam displaced persons camp alone. In other words, those in Al-Fasher are trapped in a tightening noose as the RSF closes in. abandoned by an SAF that seems to have written off the city in order to concentrate resources on retaking Khartoum and the fertile lands of the Gezira state, nearly 900 kilometers distant. The remarkable part is that it wasn't meant to be like this. For the first 6 months of the fighting, El Fasher seemed to be one of the few places in Sudan to avoid widespread carnage. Crisis Group recently ran a long article on the city, and it makes fascinating reading. Although El Fasher was the site of clashes between the two factions after the war ignited on April the 15th last year, a local ceasefire was in place by April 20th. To give you some idea of how unlikely this was, late spring of 2023 was when the SAF and the RSF were reducing the capital, Khartoum, to rubble, when major cities were going up in flames across the nation's center. Yet somehow, El Fasher remained relatively calm. Even as the conflict spread to Darfur, the fragile peace held. The city's secret lay in its tortured history. Long a hotbed of rebel activity, El Fasher is home to multiple armed groups that have fought both the SAF and the RSF. As such, they were able to declare themselves neutral actors at the civil war's outset and broker a local peace. Crisis Group informs us that the army was given the west of El Fasher and the RSF the east, with the rebel groups forming a joint neutral force to patrol the center and keep the two separate. And so, against all of the odds, El Fasher avoided the fate of Khartoum, became instead a temporary oasis in a nation on fire. Unfortunately, you already know what the keyword was in that sentence: temporary. After 6 months of fighting, the RSF had managed to sweep across Darfur, leaving El Fasher the last city standing. Apparently spooked by the paramilitary's advance, members of the neutral force ditched their neutrality and declared allegiance to the army. By April this year, the truce was in tatters. That month, the RSF formerly neutral rebels declared war on one another. So, that's the background to the current fighting around North Darfur's capital. Now we need to move on to the more important part. What would El Fasher's fall actually mean? One thing that we've not seen commented on much is that a total RSF victory in El Fasher might open the gateway to an ethnically cleansed Darfur, one that's fully under the domination of the Darfuri Arabs. That was the opinion of one man trapped inside the city who spoke to the Telegraph via phone on condition of anonymity. In his words, if El Fasher fell, it would be a human disaster. There would be no life for us here in Darfur as African people. This is because the RSF has been so brutally efficient at murdering and chasing out multiple ethnic groups over recent months. Not only would they likely kill untold numbers in El Fasher itself, but the lack of any remaining safe haven might convince those still remaining elsewhere in Darfur to flee for Chad or South Sudan. Another potential consequence of the city's fall could be to push the region even closer to starvation. As Al Jazeera notes, El Fasher is crucial for humanitarian aid in a region on the brink of famine. Already, the siege has all but halted operations there. But an RSF victory could make it even harder to get aid into the wider Darfur area. For many, though, the real fear isn't what the RSF would do locally, but what control of El Fasher would allow them to do on the war's wider stage. If Hemeti's forces take El Fasher, they will control not just the entirety of Darfur, but about 1/3 of Sudan. Importantly, they will also control the borders with Chad and Central African Republic, as well as major transport routes to Libya. Libya is key here because it's where the RSF's international backers, including the UAE and remnants of the Wagner Group, can most easily funnel the group arms, money, and fuel. Gain unimpeded access, and the RSF would be able to resupply with far greater ease than it can now. Not only that, but it would free up much-needed men and materials to refocus its efforts elsewhere. On holding back recent SAF gains in central Sudan, yes, but also on spreading its influence across the Horn of Africa. To be clear, such an outcome is not inevitable. It remains to be seen whether Hemeti's forces are capable of taking El Fasher. During an attempted attack on June the 14th, the paramilitary suffered massive losses, including local commander Ali Yagub Gibril. In fact, according to Crisis Group, there are some who even believe that the SAF's entire plan may be to suck the RSF into a quagmire around El Fasher, to keep it bogged down in this one city while the army focuses on clearing Hemeti's men out of Khartoum. Now, if that's the case, then it would be a cynical trade-off and likely a desperate one. For all they may be experiencing problems, the RSF have proven themselves ruthlessly efficient at conquest. And should El Fasher be next, it could unleash forces both sides will struggle to contain. For now, at the time of writing at least, the city's fate remains uncertain. What is certain is that the final battle for control of Darfur has begun, and its outcome could soon have effects that are felt across the entire continent. And for our final story today, we'll turn our attention to an important set of elections, to a national vote that could change the direction of one of NATO's biggest nuclear-armed states. No, we're not talking about the French parliamentary elections. While the first round's results on Sunday, June 30th, will doubtless be interesting, they're also going to be announced far too late for us to cover them in this episode. Instead, we're going to be focusing on the French vote's less lively cousin, the UK general election. In Britain, the consensus has so far been that the 2024 election is the most boring in living memory, almost as dull and as drawn out as Season 2 of Vinland Saga. But make no mistake, the UK remains a significant player in European defence. As a nuclear-armed NATO power, permanent member of the UN Security Council and staunch supporter of Ukraine, the decisions taken by the British government matter on the world stage. So, in advance of the vote on the 4th of July, we wanted to give you a rundown of the issues facing the main parties, where they stand on defence, what plans they may have for the military, and what a vote for them might mean for British defence policy in general. And the biggest thing to note, well, the differences between the two main parties, that's Conservative and Labour, are far smaller than they were at the last election. Back in 2019, Labour was led by a far-left populist Jeremy Corbyn, who advocated both the breakup of NATO and the dismantling of the UK's nuclear deterrence. But after he led the party to its worst defeat since 1935, his successor, Keir Starmer, dragged Labour relentlessly toward the centre on defence. Today, Labour and the Tories both maintain an ironclad commitment to NATO membership, as well as continuous at-sea nuclear deterrence in the form of Trident. In the UK context, that makes the two largest parties unusual. In Wales and Scotland, both the Scottish National Party and Plaid Cymru want to scrap Trident, while the Green Party wants to go even further by signing a UN pledge banning nuclear weapons. But if that sounds extreme, just know that the UK system all but guarantees smaller parties won't win enough seats to have an impact on national policy. As such, Trident's basically safe. It's the same deal with a planned defence spending hike to 2.5% of GDP. Both the Conservatives and Labour have pledged to do so, although the Tories are the only ones to have committed to a timeline. The party wants to hit 2.5% by 2030. Again, not all smaller parties agree. The hard-right Reform Party, led by Nigel Farage, wants to take spending all the way to 3%. Like the Greens, though, Reform is extremely unlikely to win enough seats to make that happen. So it goes with many aspects of defence policy. While the smaller parties may have different views, Labour and the Tories seem mostly on the same page. Regarding Ukraine, the Wilson Centre writes that both Labour and the Tories have expressed full-throated support for Ukraine in its defence against Russia. There is no distinction in their commitment. That'll be good news for Kyiv, since Britain is the third biggest donor of bilateral aid, only behind the US and Germany. In a similar vein, a change of government is unlikely to change Britain's Israel policy. Although Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy has supported the ICC's potential issuing of arrest warrants for Israeli leadership, Labour leader Keir Starmer has refused to stand by him on this issue. Today, both main parties broadly support Israel, with caveats that an independent Palestinian state must one day be established. On the Labour side, such support is expected to cost the party votes from progressives and Muslims, but with Labour 20 points ahead of the Conservatives, it's unlikely that this will swing the election. Even Al Jazeera has noted that some experts said the effect will be limited amid the general upswell of support for Labour. Regarding the other major foreign policy challenge of our time, China, differences are again small. The Tories have the stronger rhetoric on Taiwan, but Labour is unlikely to go jumping into bed with Beijing. The Wilson Centre believes that Starmer's China position is basically to follow America's lead. The one point of contention is cheap Chinese technology like electric cars and solar panels that could speed up the green transition. Labour is technically committed to a big push towards renewables, but given the awful state of public finances, the only way to achieve this might be to rely on cheap imports from China. Now, after all that consensus between the two parties, you might be starting to feel a little disillusioned if you're a British voter, wondering if there are any differences between the Tories and Labour. Well, luckily for us, there is at least one significant part of defence policy where the two are at loggerheads, and that's the size of the British military. Now, we've covered in previous videos how the British Army has dropped to its lowest staffing levels since the Napoleonic Wars, falling to a mere 72,510 full-time soldiers. What's worth repeating is that this isn't merely the national result of poor recruitment and retention, although that certainly plays a part. Rather, it is a deliberate policy the Conservatives put in place in 2021 and continue to follow despite the war in Ukraine. Even the normally pro-Tory Telegraph has given the government a kicking over this, noting that when Labour left office, the army had more than 100,000 soldiers, and using subheadings like "government accused of being deeply negligent of Britain's defence." Smaller parties are likewise using the issue as a cudgel to beat the Conservatives. The centrist Liberal Democrats, who governed in coalition with the Tories from 2010 to 2015, have pledged to build the army back up to 100,000 troops. Meanwhile, Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, John Healey, has been open about how wrong-headed he thinks the cuts have been. Still, we should note that Labour don't have any policies that would increase the size of the army. Here's the BBC. Labour have not pledged to increase the number of soldiers. All they've said is that they would hold a strategic defence review after the election. And it's not clear what this review would recommend in terms of numbers. Conservatives. Yet even if Labour badly underperforms on July the 4th and has to agree to hike troop numbers as part of a coalition deal with the Liberal Democrats, it's hard to see how they'll be able to afford it. And it's here that we get into the slightly grim part of this chapter, the part where we explain how the state of UK public finances are absolutely dire. Right now, the UK has the highest tax burden since the Second World War. Productivity is stagnant, growth is sluggish, and everything is more expensive than it used to be. To address the cost of living crisis, both major parties have ruled out tax hikes. Therefore, money for defense policy would have to come from elsewhere. But with 14 years of austerity having left public services like the NHS on the verge of collapse, it's hard to see where those cuts could fall. And this is extremely important, since even hiking defense spending to 2.5% of GDP might not be enough to deter Russia. The think tank Chatham House writes that to confront Russia and play a leading role in NATO, the UK may need to consider moving closer to states like Poland, who spend over 3%. The issue is that 2.5% simply might not cover the costs of getting the armed forces back up to scratch. After years of underinvestment, the military is creaking, while the wider defense budget is running an annual deficit of nearly £17 billion. According to the Public Accounts Committee, this deficit is largely because the costs of Britain's nuclear deterrent have ballooned. But it's also because the Ministry of Defence has been infected by reckless optimism. To quote from their most recent report, the MOD has put off making major decisions about cancelling programmes it cannot afford. Instead, it has optimistically assumed that the plan would be affordable if the government fulfilled its long-term aspiration to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence each year, despite there being no guarantee. Not cancelling these expensive programmes, like the problem-plagued Ajax fighting vehicle, has meant less money for the rest of the armed forces. The same report discusses how the military suffers, quoting here, more people leaving the armed forces than being recruited, the mothballing of Royal Navy ships due to crew shortages, and the unavailability this year of the only ship able to fully replenish aircraft carriers. Now, to be fair, where recruitment and retention are concerned, some of the parties have pledged to address it. One Labour manifesto point promises to improve service accommodation and establish an armed forces commissioner to improve service life, while Reform wants to boost basic pay and offer free education to troops. These are good policies that most people can get behind. The trouble is, they'll also be really expensive. And with both parties pledging no tax increases and other public services like the NHS, education and police also desperate for cash, there's no guarantee that the next government will be able to find the money to improve army life, at least not without cancelling some of the more expensive programmes and sucking up the loss. Here's how Chatham House brutally summed it up. Even with increased spending, a future government must make hard choices and reduce the range of capabilities and programs the UK military maintains. At the end of all that, then, it's hopefully clear that whoever forms the next government will face some tough choices. Choices about where best to allocate money to ensure the armed forces can operate at their peak. As we've already said, such a thing will not be easy. Yet, there's perhaps a silver lining here, one that comes from knowing that, in the crucial areas of defence and foreign policy, a consensus does still exist in Britain. That in an era of increasingly polarised politics, the two main parties can mostly agree on issues of national security. Such a thing today is rare. In France, everything from NATO to funding Ukraine's fight seems up for grabs. In the US, China unites the Democrats and the GOP, but Ukraine and Gaza bitterly divide them. In Germany, some even still seem to believe a rapprochement with Putin is possible, like the clock can just be spun back to early 2022 and the cheap Russian gas will just start flowing again. In this climate, it's somewhat heartening to see a country where agreement can be reached on the truly important things. The British election may not be quite as exciting as what's happening in France, but in its own small way, that may in fact be the most interesting part of all. Thanks for watching.